Hello and welcome to the Elite Family Chiropractic Podcast. I'm Dr. Scott Haggerty, a pediatric and family chiropractor who's passionate about helping kids thrive. Today, we're diving deep into a very colorful controversy that's probably sitting right in your pantry: artificial food dyes and their impact on children's neurological, emotional, and behavioral health. This episode is a deep dive, an educational journey that is a companion to our Brain Spark newsletter. So get comfortable as we unpack the science, the stories, and the regulatory shakeups around these bright hues in our food supply. Let me get started with a quick story from our practice. A few weeks ago, a mom in our clinic told me about her little boy, let's just call him James, who had an off the charts day at school after a birthday party weekend. Now, normally James is a sweet, if energetic kid, but that Monday, his teacher reported that he was unusually impulsive, irritable, and unable to focus. His mom was puzzled until she remembered the weekend: neon blue cupcakes, bright red sports drinks, Skittles, basically a rainbow of artificial colors. So she found herself asking, could all these food dyes have something to do with his behavior spike? And it's a question more and more parents are asking. And today we're going to explore the answer for you. If you've seen recent headlines or noticed changing labels at the grocery store, you know this topic is definitely heating up. In fact, 2025 has brought some major developments, including new FDA actions to rein in artificial dyes, like an upcoming ban on red dye number 3. So you have to ask yourself, why are regulators finally stepping in? What does research say about how these chemicals might affect a child's brain and nervous system? And importantly, what can we as parents do about it? We'll cover all that and more. My goal is to keep this conversation warm, relatable, and scientifically grounded, as if we're sitting together in my office talking about your child, and leave you with both practical understanding and next steps. So let's cut through the noise and dive into the real story behind those brightly colored food dyes so you know what's going on. Ready? Okay, here we go. So let's start at the top. What are artificial food dyes and why the controversy? So artificial food dyes, also called synthetic food colors, are chemicals used to give foods, drinks, all those wonderful snacks at the store, those fun, vibrant colors. Think of the electric red in fruit punch, the deep blue in a cupcake frosting, or the rainbow colors of sugary cereals. These dyes are synthetically produced, often derived from petroleum, yes, the same crude oil base used for gasoline, or previously from coal tar. They carry names like FD and C, red number 40, yellow number 5, blue number 1, etc. And there are currently 9 such dyes approved for use in the US: blue 1, blue 2, green 3, red 4, red 40, yellow number 5, yellow 6, plus 2 less common ones, orange B and citrus red 2. These additives offer zero, not a lick of nutritional value. They don't preserve food or improve its safety. They're purely cosmetic, making candies brighter or beverages more eye-catching. Food companies use them because, frankly, color sells. A bowl of neon-colored cereal or a popsicle in every shade of the rainbow is incredibly enticing, especially to kids. As a result, artificial food dyes have seeped into a huge array of products, not just candy and soda, but even unexpected places like pickles, soaked salmon, salad dressings, medicines, and kids' vitamins. It's no wonder that the average person today consumes about 5 times more food dye than we did in the 1950s. Our kids, often the biggest consumers of brightly colored snacks, are getting a larger dose of those chemicals than any generation ever before them. The controversy over food dyes centers on their potential effects on health, especially children's behavior and brain function. So concerns date all the way back to the 1970s, when pediatric allergist Dr. Ben Feingold hypothesized that artificial colors and some preservatives could trigger hyperactivity and learning issues in some children. This led to the famous Feingold diet, which eliminated artificial additives from every child's diet. Early studies of the Feingold diet were mixed, and a 1983 analysis found any behavioral effects to be very small. For a while, it seemed the scientific community essentially had written it off as largely a placebo effect or something affecting only a rare few. However, the issue refused to disappear. Through the 80s and 90s, parents continued to report that cutting out certain candies or brightly colored drinks helped their kids behave better. Researchers kept poking at the question with small trials. By the 2000s, the evidence was hinting that the Feingold folks might have been onto something really after all. We started seeing more rigorous studies and even government reviews in Europe and the US examining whether artificial dyes can cause or worsen issues like hyperactivity, ADHD symptoms, mood swings, or learning problems. Today, the topic is still hotly debated, But we have a lot more data than we used to. In fact, modern reviews conclude that some children are indeed extremely sensitive to food dyes, and that removing them from that diet can lead to measurable improvements in behavior in those kids. It's not all kids, far from it, but it's a significant minority. More on the numbers here in a few moments. So this has turned what used to be a fringe idea into a mainstream public health discussion. Parents, pediatricians, psychiatrists, and neurologists are increasingly aware of the connection, and many advocacy groups have pressured food companies and regulators to take action. Even the FDA, long skeptical that dyes cause behavioral issues, convened a panel in 2011 to begin to review the evidence. At that time, they stopped short of banning dyes or requiring warning labels, but they did acknowledge that some children might be sensitive to these substances. So fast forward to 2025, and the landscape is dramatically shifting. The FDA itself has started rolling out new rules to curtail certain dyes, citing safety concerns. We'll delve into those actions a little bit later, but here's a preview. Red dye number 3, a cherry red color often found in candies and cake decorations, is actually set to be banned from foods and drinks in the US after decades of debate. And broader phase-outs of other synthetic dyes are on the horizon. The fact that regulators are moving after decades of inertia tells you something about the strength of the evidence, and of course, especially the public concern. So why the controversy? Because not everyone reacts to dyes the same way, and industry stakeholders long argued that dyes are safe at the low levels found in foods. If you look at the FDA's official stance over the years, they've maintained that approved dyes are safe for the general population when used according to regulations. The FDA set acceptable daily intake (ADI) levels for each dye based upon animal toxicology studies from many years ago, and said as long as intake stays below those levels, there shouldn't be a problem. For a long time, concerns about hyperactivity were dismissed as anecdotal or not conclusively proven. However, newer research, including clinical trials, meta-analysis, and animal studies, have challenged that complacency. It appears those old safety studies didn't even look for subtle neurobehavioral effects. And when scientists actually did look at behavior in controlled trials, many found that dyes can have effects, especially in sensitive kids. The result is a growing scientific consensus that, at the very least, caution is warranted. As one expert put it, if you see smoke, you should investigate whether there's a fire, and in the meantime, you should evacuate the children just to be safe. In other words, there may not be 100% proof of harm to every child, but there's enough evidence of potential harm to justify taking precautions. Now, let's talk specifics. What does the science actually show about food dyes and children's behavior? And what might be happening in the brain and body to explain it? So that honestly is the biggest question. Can those milligrams of red 40 or yellow number 5 in a cupcake really change how a child behaves or feels? According to a growing body of research, the answer in some children is a definitive yes. Let's break down next what the studies have found. So the clinical evidence, studies done in children, suggest that a subset of kids experience adverse behavioral reactions to artificial colors. The most common effect studied is hyperactivity, things like fidgeting, impulsivity, difficulty sitting still or concentrating, and general acting out. So some studies have also noted increased irritability, restlessness, or sleep disturbances. These effects are often subtle, but we're not talking about instantly turning calm kids into Tasmanian devils, but they can be significant enough that parents and teachers notice a noticeable difference. One landmark study that raised eyebrows was published in 2007 in The Lancet. In this UK-based trial, researchers gave kids in the general population, not just kids with ADHD, a drink containing a mix of common dyes and a preservative, and measured their behavior over the next few hours and days. They tested 2 age groups, 3-year-olds and 8 and 9-year-olds. The results showed increased hyperactivity in both groups after consuming the artificial dye mix compared to when they consumed a placebo. In plain terms, ordinary kids got a bit more jumpy, impulsive, or inattentive when they had a cocktail of food coloring. That was a very big deal because it suggested dye-related hyperactivity isn't just an issue for kids already labeled as hyperactive. It could potentially affect any child if the dose is high enough. Now, hyperactivity can be pretty subjective, and behavior in kids naturally fluctuates from day to day. That's why we look to placebo-controlled double-blind studies, where neither the families nor the researchers know when the child is getting the real dye or a placebo. To really test this, we have to have these kind of things. Thankfully, many such trials have been done. In 2004, a pair of researchers named Schab and Trin combed through numerous small trials and did what's called a meta-analysis, which is essentially pulling data to get a clearer picture. They focused on studies of kids who already had hyperactivity or ADHD. Their analysis found that artificial food colors did, in fact, worsen hyperactive behaviors in these children. But interestingly, the effect was most obvious in parent ratings of their kids' behavior. Teacher or clinician ratings in those studies didn't show as strong an effect. This could mean a couple of things. Number one, parents might be more attuned to their child's diet and subtle behavior changes at home, which we would hope, or perhaps there was some bias, parents expecting a change. Even so, the signal was there. Dyes could promote hyperactivity, especially in kids suspected to be sensitive in the first place. Now, by 2012, enough studies had accumulated that scientists tried to quantify how many kids are affected. A notable meta-analysis that year, led by Dr. Joel Nigg and colleagues, concluded that around 8% of children with ADHD may have their symptoms exacerbated by synthetic food colors. Think about that. If you have 100 kids with ADHD, perhaps roughly 8% of them are meaningfully worse when they ingest artificial food dyes, and presumably would be better on a dye-free diet. 8% isn't huge, but it's not trivial either. ADHD at this point, unfortunately, is common. And 8% of the millions of ADHD kids is a lot of children. Plus, those are just the kids with a formal ADHD diagnosis. There could be others without a diagnosis who can also react. So the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, boy, what a long name that is, a state scientific agency, conducted one of the most comprehensive reviews recently published back in 2021. They evaluated 27 clinical studies on dyes and children's behavior, covering kids both with and without behavioral disorders. Here's what they found. In 25 of those studies where kids were challenged with dyes, meaning given dyes to see if symptoms occur, 16 of them found evidence of a link between dyes and worse behavior, and 13 of those studies showed a statistically significant effect. Now, not every study showed an effect. Some showed no difference, but more than half did, which is a strong signal. Many of these positive studies relied on parent observations of behavior, which again tended to be more sensitive to changes than teacher reports. The OEHHA scientists noted that these studies collectively support an association between synthetic dyes and adverse behavior in children. Now, it's important to underscore, not all children are affected by dyes. In fact, most children can probably gulp a brightly colored slushie or eat a bag of Skittles, and you never notice a change aside from a sugar rush, perhaps. The research suggests it's a subset of kids who react, but we often can't predict who ahead of time. Some kids with ADHD, some without, some toddlers, some older kids, there's a lot of individual variability. This variability is a big reason there's controversy. If dyes affected every child, obviously, we'd have banned them long ago. Instead, we have this situation where some parents swear dyes turn their kids into a hyperactive tornado, while others see no effect at all. But beyond hyperactivity, what about emotional and behavioral effects? These are less studied in clinical trials, which tend to use ADHD type rating scales. But anecdotal reports and some experts have noted issues like mood changes, irritability, or aggression in certain kids after consuming food dyes. For instance, an OSU study that was done by Dr. Eugene Arnold, a well-known ADHD researcher, pointed out that food dyes can make some children not only hyperactive, but also moody or irritable. Parents have described dye reactions where a child becomes unusually whiny, angry, or prone to meltdowns after a birthday party binge on colored goodies. Sleep can definitely be affected too. Some kids have trouble settling down at night if they've had a lot of artificial colors during the day. And this is potentially because of the stimulating effects that we'll talk about here in a minute. There's also the question of whether food dyes might affect children with neurodevelopmental differences beyond ADHD, such as autism. Research specific to autism is limited, but a 2024 review noted that children on the autism spectrum might be particularly impacted by synthetic colors. One reason is that many autistic children have restricted diets and strong preferences, often favoring processed foods of certain colors and brands, and this is sometimes termed ARFID, which is also known as avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, common in kids with autism. If a child with autism will only eat, say, neon-colored chicken nuggets and nothing else, their exposure to dyes can be very high. Some reports suggest these kids might show increased repetitive behaviors or irritability related to dye consumption. However, to say the least, we need more studies to confirm direct effects in ASD. it does stand to reason that any child with a sensitive nervous system or difficulties in behavior regulation might be extra vulnerable to a dietary trigger. ADHD, autism, sensory processing disorders, all of these would fall under neurodiverse populations that could react more strongly. And indeed, experts note that younger children and those with conditions like ADHD are most likely to react to dyes. And I can tell you, I have seen this very strongly myself. So, to sum up the clinical findings, for a small but significant proportion of children, consuming artificial food dyes can lead to measurably worse behavior, typically more hyperactivity or impulsivity, and in some cases, moodiness and even aggression. These effects are more apparent in sensitive individuals like some kids with ADHD or behavioral issues, but they are not necessarily limited to them. The majority of kids aren't obviously bouncing off the walls with a little food coloring, but we can't identify the sensitive ones except by observing them. This is why many parents have their own aha moment when they eliminate dyes as a test. If their child is one of the reactors, the difference can be dramatic. Now, you might be wondering, how much dye are we talking about? Are these studies giving us ridiculous megadoses or amounts that kids actually consume? And honestly, this is a great question. And that brings us to the concept of what's called dose-dependent effects. So one crucial thing that we've learned is that dose matters. The effect of food dyes on behavior seem to be dose-dependent, meaning a small amount might not have a noticeable effect in most kids, but a larger amount can trigger reactions in more children and more intense reactions in sensitive children. This mirrors a basic principle of toxicology. The dose makes the poison. So while food dyes aren't poison in the classical sense, the idea is that higher exposures are more likely to cause problems. Early clinical studies back in the 70s and 80s often used around 20 to 30 milligrams of a mixed food dye blend in their challenges. For example, giving a child a drink or capsule with 26 milligrams of mixed dyes. These studies tended to find that only a small percentage of children reacted, leading many doctors to conclude at the time that dyes weren't really a big deal. But later studies began using higher doses, like 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams, or more, and guess what? They found a significantly larger percentage of children showing behavioral effects. In fact, clinical trials have reported that doses up to 30 to 35 milligrams of artificial colors will affect a modest percentage of sensitive kids, whereas doses of 100 milligrams or more can affect a much larger percentage of children. That tells us there is a threshold effect. Some kids might need a higher exposure before you see a change, and the most sensitive population will react at a much lower dose. Now, how does that compare to real life? Could a child realistically consume 100 milligrams of food dye in a day? Unfortunately, moms and dads, yes, quite easily. In fact, a detailed analysis by researchers at Purdue University in 2014 measured dye content in common foods and found some, crazy startling numbers. For instance, a single serving of a breakfast cereal like Trix or Fruity Cheerios contained around 30 to 36 milligrams of artificial dyes. One pouch of Skittles has about 33 milligrams of dyes, and a bag of M&Ms about 29 milligrams. A single cupcake without colorful frosting can pack over a single cupcake with colorful frosting can pack over 50 milligrams of dyes. And an 8-ounce bottle of a brightly colored sports drink like Gatorade or soda can have anywhere from 20 milligrams up to 50 milligrams of dye. For example, Orange Crush has about 33 milligrams of artificial dyes. Sunny D has 41, and Kool-Aid Burst Cherry has 52 milligrams per serving. So imagine a kid at a birthday party. They have a cupcake, a cup of punch, and some colored candies. It is quite conceivable they've just gulped down 100 plus milligrams of dye in a single afternoon. And that's not including the sugar content and all the other stuff that's in there. Or consider a child's whole day. A bowl of dyed cereal at breakfast, 30 milligrams. A bag of chips or crackers with dye at lunch, so like Cheez-Its, 5 to 10 milligrams. A candy after school, 20 milligrams. And a popsicle after dinner, 15. Add it up. The Purdue researchers estimated that a child could easily consume over 100 milligrams of artificial dyes in a day, and some children, particularly those who love colorful junk foods, could exceed 200 milligrams per day easily. Those figures are well within the range that studies have found cause hyperactivity in non-reactive kids. Even daily habits can matter. A child who has a daily habit of drinking of a certain bright red punch or eating just one pack of candy after school might be chronically exposing their system to these dyes. If that children is one of the sensitive ones, that daily dose, even if it's moderate, might be enough to keep kids slightly more irritable or unfocused than they would be otherwise. So, an expert noted that kids who regularly eat dyed foods become high strung and anxious as their normal. Think about that. Not that dyes directly cause an anxiety disorder, but they could elevate a child's baseline level of agitation and restlessness, potentially creating symptoms. Interestingly, some of the very early studies might have underestimated the effect of dyes because they didn't use high enough doses. And I think this is becoming somewhat obvious at this point. Back then, researchers thought giving 20 to 30 milligrams was plenty to test the hypothesis. If only a few kids reacted, they concluded, meh, not a big issue. But now, given what we know about how much kids today can consume, 20 milligrams might have been just a simple drop in the bucket. As one researcher, Dr. Laura Stevens from Purdue, put it earlier, earlier trials with 26 milligrams found only a few kids reacted, leading doctors to be skeptical. Later trials with more realistic, bigger doses found more kids had reacted, though some dismissed those doses unrealistically high. Yet now we see real kids often get those high doses in their actual diet every single day. In her words, even the larger amounts may not have been high enough to reflect what kids are actually eating on a daily basis. And it's long past time for the FDA to get dyes out of the food supply. So the dose-dependent picture is this. Low doses, maybe only the very sensitive kids react. At moderate to high doses, a far broader group of kids start to show effects. The most sensitive children might react to just a bowl of diet cereal, less than, approximately 30 milligrams, with noticeable hyperactivity or irritability. Less sensitive children might need a whopping 100 milligrams in a day to show a change, and many kids might not react visibly, even then, because quite honestly, everyone's biochemistry is different. This is similar to say, how some people get jittery with one cup of coffee while others can have a triple espresso and feel fine. Individual tolerance definitely varies. Another aspect of dose is what we talked about earlier is cumulative exposure. A child might handle a small amount occasionally with no issues, but what about chronic daily exposure? There's some concern, though not as well studied, that constant intake of synthetic dyes could have cumulative or subtle long-term effects on a child's neurodevelopment or behavior. Maybe it's not enough to cause a visible one-day spike in hyperactivity, but perhaps it contributes to a child being a little more distractible over months or affects their sleep quality night after night. And we don't have definitive evidence on long-term low-level exposure effects on behavior, but given what we see in short-term challenges, many experts err on the side of minimizing chronic exposure, especially for kids who already struggle with attention or mood regulation. Individual sensitivity is another piece of the puzzle. Why do only some kids react to dyes while others seem impervious? Well, this is a fascinating question, and science has some clues. It turns out genetics and biology may play a pretty large role. Research, including a UK study done by Stevenson et al., has identified certain genetic differences that might make a child more susceptible to dye effects. Specifically, differences in genes related to histamine and dopamine seem to matter. Histamine genes, like some children have genetic polymorphisms, basically genetic variants in the enzymes that break down histamine. Notably, the histamine N-methyltransferase, or HNMT gene. Histamine is a compound involved in immune reactions. It's what gets released during allergies, but it's also a neurotransmitter in the brain that promotes alertness and wakefulness. Now, normally, histamine levels are pretty tightly regulated, and studies have found that kids with certain variants of the HNMT gene, which might make them slower at degrading the histamine, had greater adverse behavior reactions to a dye mix. The idea is that artificial dyes may trigger the release of histamine as a part of a minor or immune or sensitivity reaction. And if a child's body can't clear the histamine quickly, it could lead to more pronounced symptoms like hyperactivity or irritability. Since histamine in the brain makes you alert, like think of how some allergy medicines that block histamine can make you drowsy. The opposite also can be true. Extra histamine equals extra alert and activated. And a spike in histamine could feasibly lead to sleep trouble, impulsivity, and that wired but irked feeling. This mechanism is quite compelling because it bridges the gap between a food additive and a behavioral response via a known biochemical pathway. In fact, one study in the American Journal of Psychiatry found that kids with certain histamine gene variants had significantly different ADHD symptom responses to food additives, and that's a big deal. There's also dopamine genes, and dopamine is another key neurotransmitter. It's involved in focus, motivation, and pleasure. The Stevenson study also found that polymorphisms in the dopamine transporter gene DAT1 appeared to moderate how 8 to 9-year-old children responded to the dyes. The dopamine transporter helps clear dopamine from synapses. Certain variants might make dopamine signaling less efficient, which is actually a trait linked to ADHD in some cases. And if dyes somehow interact with the dopamine system directly or indirectly, kids with a vulnerable dopamine regulation might be hit harder. An Ohio State research article also noted that dyes were linked to genes producing dopamine and histamine, suggesting some kids' neurochemistry, especially involving dopamine, might amplify dye effects. Now, we don't yet know the precise interaction. It could be that dyes affect dopamine levels or receptors in the brain, or that an overstimulated state from histamine or other factors throws off dopamine balance. But the genetic clues are a big hint that this is not just in people's heads. It's very, very strongly rooted in bio and neurochemistry. Now, beyond genetics, other factors can influence sensitivity. Baseline health and behavior matter. A child with existing ADHD, anxiety, or other challenges might have a more fragile equilibrium, such like that a little dietary jolt has a big impact. Dr. Arnold from OSU noted that children with diagnoses like ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder, also known as ODD, can experience worse symptoms after dyes. For example, irritability or defiant and aggressive behavior in ODD kids who consume artificial colors and flavors. He also mentioned that even some kids with anxiety might get worse, possibly because dyes could affect gut bacteria and indirectly anxiety levels. A reminder of what's called the gut-brain axis, which we'll touch on later. Now, younger children in general seem more susceptible than adults, likely because their brains are still developing and their metabolism is entirely different. And per pound of body weight, kids often consume more dyes than adults do. So if their diet is full of colorful kiddie food, they're getting much higher exposure on a daily basis. Now, so in practical terms, if you suspect your child might be sensitive to dyes, a big factor to consider is how much they're getting, and how often they're getting this, because obviously we have to consider chronic exposure. Sometimes parents will say, well, my kid gets a little lollipop with dye and I didn't see a change, so I guess dyes don't affect him. But then later they realize the cumulative effect, maybe one lollipop is fine, but lollipop and dyed cereal, fluorescent cheese puffs, or sports drinks all in one day is a tipping point for them. The frequency of exposure can also be a key. A one-time treat might not cause a blip, but regular intake might lead to persistent issues or priming the child so that the next dose triggers a reaction. And that priming is really, really important because it really trains the nervous system to be more reactive. It's kind of like how allergies work. Now, let's pivot a bit here. We've discussed what can happen, hyperactivity, etc., and how often or at what dose does it happen. But how and why do food dyes produce these effects? What's going on inside a child's body and brain when an artificial color is consumed? For that, we need to talk mechanisms. Now, it's fascinating and oftentimes a little unnerving to think that a simple colored snack can tweak a child's behavior. But when you break it down, food dyes are chemicals and our bodies can react to chemicals in various ways. The truth is, we're still unraveling all the mechanisms by which synthetic dyes might affect the nervous system. But researchers have proposed several plausible pathways, and let's explore a few. First is histamine and immune response. Now, we've already touched on this, but it's worth emphasizing. Some artificial dyes, particularly the azo dyes like yellow dye number 5, also known as tartrazine, and yellow number 6, also known as sunset yellow, are known to cause pseudo-allergic reactions in sensitive individuals. Now, these aren't true IgE-mediated allergies, but they can trigger the release of histamine and other inflammatory mediators. In some kids, consuming a dye can be akin to exposing them to an allergen. Their body releases histamine, which can lead to flushing, itching, maybe a rash, or mild hives. Some asthmatics, for example, have noted their asthma worsens with yellow number 5 due to histamine release. Even if no obvious allergy symptoms occur, that histamine surge is happening internally. As we discussed, histamine in the brain acts as a neurotransmitter that promotes wakefulness and alertness. Excess histamine could make a child overly alert, and that kind of wired jittery alert that can look like hyperactivity or anxiety. It might also disrupt sleep cycles. Histamine is involved heavily in our sleep-wake regulation. Now, The genetic evidence that kids who are slower at breaking down histamine can have stronger reactions due to dyes underscores this mechanism entirely. So, one mechanism, dyes cause the body to release histamine or similar chemicals, which then affect the brain and behavior. This is akin to how some kids get wild after food colorings as if they were given a dose of a mild stimulant. Histamine could be that stimulant. There's also neurotransmitter changes. Scientists have looked at whether dyes directly affect the brain chemistry, things like levels of dopamine, serotonin, etc., which are critical for mood and attention. Early animal studies back in the 70s and 80s didn't find big changes in neurotransmitter levels after dye exposure. However, more recent animal studies using modern techniques have found that dyes can indeed cause changes in the brain. For example, studies in rats have shown that chronic high doses of common food dyes led to changes in gene expression for neurotransmitter receptors and enzymes, and even localized shifts in neurotransmitter levels in certain brain regions. One study cited an environmental health review found that synthetic colors could alter the activity of enzymes that regulate neurotransmitter systems. Another found changes in dopamine receptor levels in the brain of rats exposed to diets with dyes. If you alter neurotransmitter systems, you can certainly alter behavior. Dopamine and serotonin imbalances, for instances, are well known to affect impulsivity, mood, and activity levels. There's also some intriguing lab research. One old science paper from 1980 showed that food dye, I believe it was yellow dye number 5, could affect neurotransmitter release at nerve terminals in a petri dish. This was a lab study on neuromuscular synapses, the connection between nerves and muscles, showing that certain dyes might interfere with the normal release of neurotransmitters that signal muscles. Now, while that's not the same as causing ADHD, it demonstrates that dyes aren't biologically inert. They can interact with cell processes. There's also oxidative stress and brain inflammation. Now, a growing theme in neurodevelopmental disorders, things like ADHD, autism, sensory issues, etc., is oxidative stress and neuroinflammation. Basically, an excessive amount of reactive oxygen species and inflammation in the brain can affect behavior directly. Several food dyes have been shown to cause oxidative stress in cells or animal tissues. For instance, studies found that yellow number 5 and red 40 can lead to increased markers of oxidative damage in the brain tissues of rats. The OEHHA review highlighted that giving antioxidants to animals could prevent some of the neurobehavioral effects caused by dyes, which very strongly suggests that dyes were causing oxidative stress as a part of their toxic mechanism. Oxidative stress in the brain can impair how neurons function and communicate, potentially leading to issues with attention or behavior. It can also trigger inflammation, and neuroinflammation is heavily linked to changes in mood and activity. Think of how some people get foggy or irritable when sick with inflammation. So, mechanism 2. Now, dyes may induce oxidative stress and mild inflammation in the nervous system affecting behavior. Indeed, researchers have observed brain changes in animals fed high dye diets, including decreased numbers of neurons in glial cells and changes in neuron shape and even reduced volume in parts of the prefrontal cortex, which, if you haven't heard about this before, it's a key area for attention and behavior regulation. And they've seen this in a few different studies. Now these were at high doses, but it is telling that dyes can do certain things that can really damage the brain under experimental conditions. So let's keep going. There are the endocrine and thyroid effects. Certain dyes have hormone-related actions. Now, the poster child here is red 3, which is also known as erythrocin. The one being banned in foods by 2027. And if you haven't heard about this, this is a big deal. Red 3 is actually an organoiodine compound, and it contains iodine like the thyroid hormone thyroxine does. And high doses of red 3 caused thyroid tumors in rats in research studies. The mechanism was a rat-specific hormonal mechanism. Basically, it was messing with their thyroid function. Now, the FDA stresses that this particular mechanism doesn't apply to humans in the same way, and indeed, we haven't seen evidence that consuming red 3 causes thyroid issues in people. However, it's an example of a dye interacting with the endocrine system. There's also some data that certain dyes might have estrogenic or other hormone disrupting properties in lab assays. Now, how would that affect behavior? Well, thyroid hormone in childhood is crucial for brain development. Severe disruptions will cause cognitive impairment. Now, we're not seeing that from food dyes at normal exposure, but subtle shifts in hormone levels could potentially influence mood or energy. The OEHHA review listed endocrine-mediated effects as one possible pathway, though obviously more research is needed. At the very least, Red 3's story reminds us that dyes can have systemic biological effects, not just be pretty colors. Now, there's also the gut brain axis. The gut microbiome and gut health play an often underappreciated role in behavior and brain function. Some artificial dyes, especially the azo dyes, which are a type of dye with a particular chemical structure, are known to be broken down by gut bacteria and other compounds. For example, when you ingest red number 40, also called allura red, or yellow number 5, your gut bacteria may metabolize them into aromatic amines and other metabolites. Some of these breakdown products could be toxic or affect the nervous system. There was a recent study done in 2022 that got media attention, showing allura red consumption in mice led to gut inflammation and impacted behaviors in a way suggesting that it might even contribute to susceptibility to disorders like colitis. Now, while that study was about gut disease, it hints that dyes can't alter gut biology. And if dyes alter the composition of the gut microbiome or cause low-grade inflammation in the gut, that's significant because that gut produces a lot of neurotransmitters like serotonin and communicates with the brain via the vagus nerve and immune signals. OEHHA noted that future studies should see if dyes act on the gut to influence behavior via the gut-brain axis. And, as Dr. Arnold had mentioned in the OSU article, disruptions in gut bacteria might be one reason dyes could worsen anxiety or mood. So let's talk mechanism. Dyes might mess with the gut environment, which in turn can affect brain function and behavior. Now, this is still a developing area of research, but it's really plausible and it's quite interesting. So let's talk about nutrient absorption and other factors. Another proposed mechanism is that artificial colors could interfere with the absorption of or bioavailability of certain nutrients. For instance, some dyes might bind to minerals or interact with enzymes in digestion. If a child is marginally deficient in something like zinc or iron, which are important for attention and cognition, and a diet high in dyes worsens that deficiency, you might see behavior changes. There's also the idea of general physiological stress. Consuming synthetic additives might just put a slight burden on the body's detox systems, which is the liver and the kidneys, which in susceptible kids could translate to noticeable behavioral changes. Now there's a bit more. This is a bit more speculative, but they have to be floated in the literature, and I think these are definitely worth investigating. One thing certainly is clear: the brain and the nervous system of a developing child are delicate and can be influenced by surprisingly small chemical nudges. A teaspoon of our artificial dye solution might seem harmless, and for most kids it probably is. But in a child whose biological or genetic makeup turns that into a cascade of histamine, oxidative stress, etc., it can disrupt the finely tuned circuits that govern behavior and mood. It's also worth noting that food dyes often travel with sugar. Most brightly food dyes are also high in refined sugars, things like candies and sodas. High sugar intake can cause blood sugar swings that affect behavior and can synergize with dyes. In fact, a 2019 review of diet and ADHD found that that diets high in refined sugar and saturated fats, basically junk food diets, were associated with worse ADHD symptoms, while diets rich in fruits and vegetables were protective. It's hard to untangle how much of that is the sugar, the dye, or other additives. Likely it's the whole package. Dyes might be one component of a generally ultra processed diet that can contribute to behavior issues. I like to frame it this way: artificial dyes are signals of low quality food. If a child's diet is filled with artificial colors, it often means they're eating a lot of processed snacks and sweets and not enough whole foods. So some of the behavioral effect may not be directly due to the dye molecule itself, but due to the overall nutritional profile of dyed foods like low fiber, high sugar, etc. That said, controlled trials isolate the dyes by keeping diets the same and just adding dye or placebo, which is how we know the dye itself can have a direct effect. But in real life, reducing dyes usually means shifting towards a healthier diet in general. And it all works together in favor of better behavior and brain function. Now, before we move on, let's just recap, because that's a lot. The key mechanisms here in simpler terms. Think of artificial dyes as troublemakers that can trigger immune responses. They can stress the brain. They can tweak neurotransmitters, disrupt hormones, disturb the gut microbiome, and can be accompanied by a number of other dietary factors like sugar that all together work to worsen behavior and can compromise their system. Now, not every dye does all of these. Not every child's body will respond in the same ways, but these are the possibilities that the scientific literature has raised. Now, understanding these mechanisms is not just academic. It actually helps when explaining to a skeptical parent or a clinician why removing something as trivial as food coloring might help a kid. It's not magic or parental imagination. These are concrete biological reasons behind it. For example, if I suspect a child is a dye responder, I might explain to their parent, some kids' bodies treat these dyes like an invader, releasing histamine or other chemicals that make them feel lousy, almost like an allergic reaction that shows up as behavior changes rather than a rash. Many parents relate to this because they see how an allergic kid can get when exposed to an allergen. Like some kids get hyper on antihistamines or cranky when they have seasonal allergies acting up. Similarly, saying these dyes can cause oxidative stress, basically a kind of chemical stress in the brain, and a child with an ADHD brain already has to work harder to stay regulated. Taking that stress off their system can sometimes really calm things down. And it makes sense to them, right? Most parents are just looking for what they can do, and changing these things can be really beneficial because of how they can directly affect their behavior. All right, and we've covered the dyes, the evidence that they can affect the behavior and potential mechanisms. The next part here of this conversation actually is what's being done about it and what can we do about it as parents and practitioners. And this is where the recent events like the FDA bans and practical advice come into play. For decades, consumer advocacy groups and concerned scientists have been urging regulators to do something about artificial dyes in foods, especially those marketed to children. Europe took the lead about a decade and a half ago after the 2007 Lancet study. The European Union required foods containing certain synthetic dyes to carry a warning label. And it basically said this: they may have an adverse effect on activity and attention in children. Rather than slap scary warnings on their products, many companies in Europe reformulated to use natural colorings like beet juice, turmeric, or natto, or just remove the dyes entirely. As a result, it's common to see British candy or drink say paprika extract for orange color, whereas the U.S. version of the same product might still use yellow number 6. It created sort of a double standard where American kids were getting the synthetic stuff while European kids got the natural version, all because of these simple regulatory differences. In the US, the FDA historically maintained the dyes were safe enough, pointing that to those ADI or acceptable daily intake levels and the lack of absolute proof of harm. They did, however, ban certain dyes over time for other reasons. Now, mostly when a dye was found to be carcinogenic, cancer-causing in animal studies. For example, Red 3, which we've mentioned, was partially banned in 1990 for use in cosmetics and externally applied drugs due to cancer concerns because had been shown to cause thyroid tumors in rats. But oddly, it was still allowed in foods because of some regulatory loophole and inertia. Similarly, several other dyes from the mid-20th century were also delisted, e.g. Things like violet number 1 and red number 2 after they were linked to health issues. So the dyes that we have today are the ones that survive the culling, but that doesn't mean they're benign. Just that they didn't obviously cause cancer in the doses tested, so they were somewhat overlooked, or they had been scrutinized for the behavioral effects. Things have come to a head recently. In 2008, the Center for Science and the Public Interest, or also known as CSPI, petitioned the FDA to ban most synthetic dyes, citing the behavioral evidence. The FDA's advisory committee meeting in 2011, which I mentioned earlier, was convened to consider this. They stopped short of a ban or really even requiring a warning label, but they did acknowledge that some evidence links dyes to hyperactivity in sensitive kids. They essentially recommended more research. California took note and funded the OEHHA review that we mentioned earlier, which not surprisingly came out saying, yes, there is a real issue here. Meanwhile, consumer pressure led to many big companies to start voluntarily reducing dyes. General Mills took dyes out of Trick cereal for a while, though, because consumer backlash over muted colors made them particularly backtrack. So they added them back in because the color change was detracting from sales. Kraft took them out of some mac and cheese lines. Many fast food chains removed certain dyes from their menu items, etc. By the mid-2010s, it was common to see packages probably stating no artificial colors. The market was beginning to shift, but obviously not as far as we wanted to as parents. Then in 2023, California passed the California Food Safety Act, also known as AB 418. And this was a law to ban several food additives by 2027, including Red 3. The others were things like brominated oil, potassium bromate, and propylparaben, which are not dyes, but other additives of concern. Initially, titanium dioxide and possibly other dyes were considered, but the final law specifically banned Red 3 among dyes. This made California the first state to say, if the feds won't act, we will. And because California's market is huge, this effectively pressures companies to change recipes nationwide because they won't have to have 2 recipes for California versus the rest of the US. Now, Facing this pressure and accumulating science, the FDA finally took a significant step, and this was under new administration. In January 15th, 2025, the FDA announced that it will revoke authorization for the use of FD&C red number 3 in foods and ingested medications. They cited the Delaney Clause, a part of a federal law that forbids any cancer-causing additives to be in foods. Those old rat studies on red 3 and cancer were the trigger. Even though the FDA noted that the mechanism of cancer in rats doesn't necessarily apply to humans and typical human exposure in as much, the law is the law. If it caused cancer in animal tests, out it must go. So this was a great opportunity for them to really begin to make regular change. And I think this is to be of note, right? It took 30 years of debate. Red number 3 is finally on its way out in the food industry. God only knows why it took so long, but finally things are starting to change. Manufacturers have until 2027 to phase it out of foods and 2028 for ingested drugs, but many will likely move faster now that the writing is very plainly on the wall. But that's not all. Just a few months later, in April of 2025, the FDA, in conjunction with HHS, announced an even broader initiative to phase out petroleum-based synthetic dyes from the entire nation's food supply. Now, this is huge news. The FDA's new measures include setting a timeline for the food industry to transition to natural color alternatives. So what they're doing is they're initiating the process to ban 2 or more dyes, including citrus 2 and orange B, which are lesser known colorants used on orange skins and some sausage casings, and working with industry to eliminate the 6 remaining common dyes, which would be red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6, blue 1, blue 2, and green 3 by the end of next year. Essentially, they're asking companies to get rid of all synthetic dyes, something that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. They're also fast-tracking approvals of more natural color additives, like new sources of blue from spirulina or butterfly pea flower, etc. To help companies make the switch. And importantly, the FDA and NIH are partnering to do more research on how food additives impact children's health and development, a sign that they realize there might be other ingredients, not just dyes, that deserve scrutiny for behavioral effects. This FDA announcement even had some pretty strong language. The HHS secretary, surprisingly named Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in the scenario, was quoted saying, "For too long, some food producers have been feeding Americans petroleum-based chemicals without their knowledge or consent. These poisonous compounds offer no nutritional benefit and pose real, measurable dangers to our children's health and development. That area is coming to an end." I would say those are some pretty strong words, calling the dyes toxic and pointing to child health dangers. The FDA Commissioner, Marty Makary, referenced the epidemic of childhood ADHD and said, given concerns about dyes, we should not be taking risks and should do everything possible to safeguard the health of our children. This is a sea change in tone from the FDA. Essentially, the leadership is saying, look, these synthetic dyes are unnecessary, potentially harmful, and the US should catch up to Europe in getting rid of them. I think it's fantastic because it's all about protecting our kids. Now, we should note, these measures are being rolled out with timelines, and it's not an overnight ban on everything, but the direction is clear. Within a couple of years, we may see virtually all artificial food coloring removed from the American food system, or at least greatly reduced. Manufacturers are likely preparing by testing natural dyes, which sometimes are less vibrant or stable, but the tech is definitely improving. We as consumers might see some colors of our favorite candies change slightly, or labels like colored with beet juice. And I think that's going to be a great thing because it's a positive development for kids' health, though some folks grumble about government overreaching or missing the bright neon colors. Personally, as a pediatric health practitioner, I see it as aligning our food system with the precautionary principle. If something has no benefit and some risk, why not eliminate it and use a safer alternative? Another benefit of removing these dyes is reducing exposure disparities. Kids from families that can afford all natural organic products have been avoiding food dyes for years, but kids in lower income families who might rely on cheaper processed foods have been disproportionately exposed to dyes in high levels. Policy change can level that playing field so all children are finally going to be protected. Thank God. It's also worth mentioning that public pressure and parent advocacy played a huge role in this shift. Companies care about their image, and as parents become more label savvy and started demanding dye-free color options, the market began to respond. If you're a parent and whoever wrote to a company or chose a brand over another because it was dye-free, you contributed to this momentum. Advocacy groups like CSPI kept the pressure on by publishing reports, and scientists just kept digging into the data. It is a great example of how awareness plus advocacy can lead to tangible change in our food environment. Now, even with these changes, Dyes won't disappear overnight. And until they do, and even after, since imported foods and certain niche products might still have them, parents will still need to be vigilant and informed. Now, this brings us to a practical side. What can you, as a parent or a caregiver, do to protect and support your child? And also, how do we approach this topic in a balanced, compassionate way without inducing guilt or panic? So, as a pediatric and family chiropractor, my focus is on the whole child, particularly through the lens of the nervous system. You might wonder, what does chiropractic have to do with food dyes? Well, a lot. When we consider nervous system regulation, I think it's like the center of this entire equation. Chiropractors in the pediatric realm often talk about kids in balance versus kids who are stuck in fight or flight, which is called sympathetic overdrive. We also look at how lifestyle factors, including nutrition, influence a child's stability or ability to regulate themselves, focus, and grow. When I see a child who's struggling with behavioral issues, concentration, and mood swings, I'm not just looking at their spine. I'm looking at their whole lifestyle and environment. Diet is a big part of that. If a child's consuming something their nervous system perceives as irritating or stress inducing, it can absolutely manifest in their behavior and how they feel. We call those things stressors. They can be physical, like poor sleep or injury, emotional, like anxiety or family stress, or chemical. And that's where the artificial food dyes count as chemical stressors for some, and I would say many kids. They may trigger an internal stress response through histamine, inflammation, oxidative stress, things like that, which then tip the autonomic nervous system towards fight or flight. A child in that state might be more impulsive, less able to sit still, more reactive emotionally. Essentially, the behaviors we identify as problematic. I often explain to parents very simply, your child's nervous system is like the gears of a car. We have drive, which is like the sympathetic mode, active, energetic, and park, which is the parasympathetic mode, calm and resting. We want those gear shifts to happen appropriately, but certain chemicals can really slam the nervous system into high gear and break the switch, so it's stuck in overdrive. An artificial dye that causes a flush of histamine or cortisol can be that gear slamming chemical. The result is a child who cannot downshift to calm and focus. As a pediatric chiropractor, I look at the physical stress dyes might cause, but honestly, it's interesting. Some kids who come in with tension headaches or just that wired and tired look, you can clean up their diet, and even those physical complaints can improve. The body is an integrated whole. We can adjust the spine and reduce the physical neurological stressors, but if the child is drinking a quart of Red 40 every day, that chemical stress can still wind them up. And true wellness care addresses all these facets. Now, I always approach this with compassion and realism. Not every family can go 100% dye free overnight. And I never want to shame a parent for what they've been feeding their child, because that's not their fault. They don't know what they don't know. And we've all been there. The convenience of a bag of colorful fruit snacks to appease a fussy toddler on a car ride's hard to beat. I remind parents and myself that moderation and gradual improvements are really and truly the most important key. It's not about it's not about never letting a drop of artificial color touch your child's lips. It's about reducing exposure and seeing if it makes a difference, and then over time trying to consistently reduce it. I also stress that if a child doesn't seem to react to dyes, that's great, but avoiding them is still positive, because it usually means eating better foods. And if a child does react, it's like discovering a secret lever that you can pull to help your child. So why not use it? So my clinical experience addressing food dyes is part of a broader strategy of supporting the pediatric nervous system. Combine that with other things like ensuring good sleep, adequate exercise to burn off energy and boost brain chemistry in a healthy way, and maybe supportive supplements like omega-3s for brain health, and you can see profound changes. There's nothing more gratifying than seeing a child who is struggling to start to flourish and knowing that simple changes like a diet cleanup contributed to that. Now that we've covered the science and stories, let's just equip you guys here with some tangible next steps. By now, you might be thinking, all right, I'm convinced, or at least curious, that artificial dyes could be an issue. What should I do about it? Well, this is the part where I want to empower you with practical, actionable advice. Because I think knowledge is wonderful, but action makes a difference for your child. So let's lay out some steps in consideration. Number one, read labels and know the code names. Start checking the ingredient labels on the foods in your pantry, especially those marketed to kids. The artificial food dyes will typically appear towards the end of the ingredient list because they're used in small amounts. Look for names like FD&C, red number 40, red number 3, yellow 5, yellow 6, blue number 1, blue 2, and green 3. Sometimes they'll be in parentheses as part of a color mix or simply listed as artificial color, red 40, blue 1, etc. Get familiar with those names. You don't need to memorize which number corresponds to which color, just recognize them as red flags. If you see a rainbow of numbers on the label, that's a product to be very, very cautious with. So, as Dr. Arnold succinctly advised, start skimming those long ingredient lists for red 40, blue 1, yellow 5. You'd be surprised how many products that have them. It's crazy the amount. Even things that look plain, like white cake mix or marshmallows, can contain blue 1 or other dyes. to give a brighter white appearance. Next is identify the biggest sources in your child's diet. Not all diet foods are equal. Some might be occasional treats, others daily staples. So make a list, mental or written, of what your child typically contains that has food dyes. Some big common contributors are cereals with colors, fruity or chocolate candies, brightly colored drinks like sport drinks, certain juices and sodas, ice pops, cake and cookie decorations, flavored yogurts, or fruit snacks with fun colors, gelatin desserts, and some brands of mac and cheese or chips. Also, consider things like vitamins or medicines. Many children's medicines or chewable vitamins are artificially colored. And so think of things like the pink bubblegum antibiotics or the purple cough syrup, the Flintstones vitamins, and yes, they most definitely have food dyes. Once you have your list, you can start to gauge how significant the exposure is and where it's coming from, and this will help you target what to try, to swap out. The next is do a trial elimination. The best way to know if your child is sensitive is to do a 2 to 3 week trial of a dye-free diet. It doesn't have to be perfect, but aim for as close to zero artificial colorings as possible for a solid block of time. This allows the child's system to clear out any built-up effects because dyes don't exactly bioaccumulate like some toxins, but a week or two lets any behavioral patterns begin to normalize or the system calm down. Now, as we talked about with the inflammation and the stress, during this time, observe any change in your child's behavior, sleep, or mood. It can be very helpful to inform teachers or caregivers that you're giving this experiment so they can let you know if they see differences too, without obviously telling them which week it is, to keep it blind on their end. If possible, keep other routines the same to really isolate the effect. Many parents report very noticeable improvements. So let's just say, for example, little boys and little Johnny here might be less prone to outbursts, or does his homework with less fuss, or less fights with siblings, and decreased emotional outbursts. Some see changes in just a few days. For others, it might take a full 2 weeks. If you don't see any changes at all, it's possible dyes weren't affecting your child in an obvious way, or there was not enough accumulation. Either way, regardless, after the elimination, you could do a challenge, introduce a known food dye, maybe that red drink or some candies in a controlled way, and watch for 24 to 48 hours. Does anything change? If a meltdown or sleep troubles begin to present themselves, you might have your answer. If nothing happens, that's also useful too. I would also recommend finding alternatives. Going dye-free doesn't mean your child can never have colorful, fun foods. You just might need to find naturally colored alternatives. Thankfully, the market has really come a long way, and you can find naturally colored candies using fruit and vegetable extracts, things like beet juice for red, turmeric for yellow, spirulina for blue. And many big brands now offer no artificial color versions of products. You can find them at health-oriented grocery stores like, here in the Cleveland area, you find that a lot more stores are beginning to carry these in their organic sections. For example, instead of regular neon gummy bears, try gummies colored with real fruit. And these are brands out there that are doing this on a regular basis. If your child loves popsicles, make or buy ones with natural dyes or just real fruit juice. If their morning cereal is a Technicolor sugar bomb, consider switching to a brand that uses natural colors or none at all. Or transition to something like oatmeal with a bit of honey and fruit, something that is easier said than done with picky eaters, but I think still is worth a try. Now, if they adore mac and cheese with that yellow glow, know that several companies have ditched yellow 5 and 6 and use paprika and annatto for their colors now. The goal is not to deprive your child of treats, but to swap out better versions. Your child might not even notice a difference. They may, but I think a lot of kids will get used to it over time. And if they do, frame it as an adventure. We're going to try a new cool-looking treat. Often kids are remarkably adaptable, especially if the taste is very similar. And again, focus on whole foods. The simplest way to avoid artificial food dyes is to eat a mostly whole unprocessed diet. And I think this is pretty straightforward, but if you are eating, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, proteins, healthy fats, so this inherently reduces not just dyes, but a lot of other additives. Plus, as research suggests, the diet rich in fruits and veggies is associated with better behavior and lower risk of any type of neurodevelopmental symptom. I would definitely recommend, make it fun too. Like, talk about, the health benefits of the fruits and the vegetables, bring in things like, strawberries and oranges and carrots and cucumbers and purple berries. And kids often enjoy the idea of getting a rainbow when they learn it comes from nature. Now, next is be mindful of other additives. Often artificial food dyes coexist with other questionable additives like certain preservatives and artificial sweeteners. Some researchers suspect it might be the combination of additives that provoke behavior issues. For instance, the Lancet study used a combo of dyes plus sodium benzoate preservative. It might be wise to also be cautious with preservatives like sodium benzoate. or common artificial sweeteners, as those two have been occasionally implicated in behavior and health issues. Holistic cleanup could yield better results than focusing on dyes alone. So, in short, the fewer chemicals in their food, the better for a sensitive child's nervous system. Also, make sure you're talking to caregivers in schools. Make sure that they're not being given excessive amounts, and preferably any, at school or by the folks that are taking care of them, especially if you're making these cleanups. So this is where communication becomes the king. You got to talk to people, let them know you're making these changes, so they're not going to give them things that could potentially compromise your results. And don't obsess and terrify. So aim for balance. I always advise this a balanced approach. We don't want our kids or ourselves to live in fear of food or become overly restrictive to the point of stress. If avoiding dyes 90% of the time still gives your child health benefits, you might not worry about the occasional birthday cake slice or a picture, a candy every once in a while that has some. So the goal is to just have consistency and reduction. And be patient. Changing a child's diet is challenging, especially if they're picky or resistant. It can take time, and that's okay. Small changes over time really and truly do add up. The next thing I'll tell you is advocate for change. Beyond your own home, you have a voice as a consumer and a parent. As we saw, parent advocacy has helped spur big changes. You can continue that by supporting companies that make naturally colored products, but also advocate for your local politicians, advocate for your state politicians, and advocate with your federal politicians, and join advocacy groups that are pushing for change like this. Things like, Moms Across America. Great one here. They're really pushing for this. There's lots of influencers out there that are really pushing for this, like the Food Babe. Make sure that you're really becoming a part of advocacy, because your voice really does matter. Now, I know we've covered a lot today, from the biochemical nitty-gritty of histamines and neurotransmitters to real-life stories of kids bouncing off the walls or not from colorful candy. So what's the bottom line? Artificial food dyes represent an avoidable risk. They are largely unnecessary in our food supply, and for some children, they can be a hidden trigger that is disturbing their neurological balance, sparking hyperactivity, concentration problems, or mood swings. For decades, this risk was downplayed or unrecognized, but today we have a clear picture that a small subset of kids are sensitive to these chemicals, and when those kids consume dyes, their nervous system pays the price for it. Fortunately, removing these dyes often alleviates these issues, sometimes dramatically so. It's important to remember that every child's different. If your neighbor's kid can drink 2 Mountain Dews and be fine, but your kid seems to climb the walls after a single red lollipop, that's okay. We all have unique tolerances. There's no need to compare or feel that you're being paranoid just because your experience isn't universal. You as a parent are the world's leading expert on your child. Trust your observations, and if something doesn't sit right, literally or figuratively, investigate it. You have the power to be a detective and advocate for your child's health. So I also want to emphasize a couple of different things. It's about balance and realism. In an ideal world, our kids would not only want carrot sticks and water, but in the real world, bright blue birthday cakes exist and they bring joy. My perspective is lean towards the side of health as much as possible, but don't live in fear or rigidity. If your family decides to go mostly dye-free and you stick to it 90% of the time, it's fantastic, and likely enough to see major benefits. The other percent of the time, a situation arises where it happens, vacation, a treat, a birthday party, and you make a conscious exception if you choose, and get back on track afterwards. Don't stress about it. If your child's exceptionally sensitive, obviously you may want to avoid more, but we live in the real world. So as we wrap up, I just want to just emphasize change is happening. We're seeing a shift now in how society views these additives. Parents and health professionals are more aware. The FDA is finally on board, thank God, with protecting kids from needless exposure. And the food industry is finally beginning to come along, innovating with natural alternatives. I truly believe that the future for us is bright, and this issue is going to be much less of a worry because synthetic dyes will be largely phased out. And we'll look back and say, remember when kids' cereals looked like Technicolor? I mean, I sure do. And I ate lots of it as a kid. But until that day, it is comforting to know that we have agency right now. We don't have to wait for all the bans and corporate changes. Each of us can create a healthier food environment in our own homes starting today. And doing so might just bring some much needed peace and balance to our children's lives. So I'm going to leave you with this. Beyond food dyes, let's just be an example of how close, let this be an example of how closely nutrition and neurological health are intertwined. We often think of behavioral learning issues as purely physiological, psychological, or just how the kid is. But sometimes there are other things that can trigger these behaviors in our kids, and food is a big one. And it doesn't replace other interventions like behavioral therapy, chiropractic, educational support, in some cases meds if extreme situations arise, but it creates a foundation. It's like ensuring the brain soil is healthy so the child can grow and flourish. So I want to leave you with this. If you're overwhelmed by the idea of monitoring food dyes, remember, you don't have to be 100% perfect overnight. Do it over time. Slow, measurable change is the most important thing. just chip away at it. If you chip away at it, you are going to get there and you're going to be fine and your child's going to do awesome. I really want to thank you so much. I know this was a longer episode. I thank you for listening, joining me on this deep dive. I hope you find this helpful. I would encourage you to look at the newsletter, and that's the elitefamilychiropractic.substack.com newsletter, so you can get the full picture, all the research links. So if you want to go and do a deep dive, you can. It's all there. Until next time, guys, this is Dr. Scott Haggerty, encouraging you to continue your child's, continue just being the amazing parents that you are, coloring your child's world with love, health, and knowledge, and maybe a little less around 40. Stay well. God bless each and every one of you, and we'll see you in the next episode.